All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into, well, I guess you could say a pretty crucial topic, especially for island
Yeah,
nations.
yeah.
It's all about, the future of their energy, and specifically, we're zeroing in on Seychelles,
Okay, yeah.
this stunning archipelago, right, that's
Mhm.
facing, well, kind of a double whammy of a challenge, right? You've got rising sea levels on the one hand, and then this heavy reliance on imported fossil fuels on the other.
Yeah, and those two issues are very much intertwined, especially for a place like Seychelles. Climate change, vulnerability, and this dependence on energy imports, they kind of go hand in hand. And it impacts, well, pretty much everything. I mean, from their environment to their economy, it's a big deal.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's exactly why we're focusing on this really detailed research paper today. It's called, get this, Future Role of Wave Power in Seychelles, a structured sensitivity analysis empowered by a novel energy plan-based optimization tool.
Catchy title, right?
It is a mouthful. But, our main goal in this deep dive is to really figure out, okay, what role could wave power realistically play in Seychelles' energy future? And we're going to base all of that on what this study actually found. So it's going to be pretty interesting.
Yeah, and one of the things that makes this study stand out, at least for me, is just how forward-looking it is. I mean, they're using this like cutting-edge tool to analyze all these different energy pathways Seychelles could take, and not just for now, but looking ahead to 2030 and even 2050. It's like getting a glimpse into potential futures, you know?
Yeah, exactly. So for you, the listener, what we really want to do today is kind of unpack what this study is actually saying. Could wave power be a practical and cost-effective solution? And, what are the different possibilities and trade-offs involved? Like, where do we even begin to sort of break all this down?
Well, a good starting point would be to understand where Seychelles stood in terms of its energy situation when the study's data begins. Like,
Mhm.
what was their baseline, so to speak?
Okay, so back to the basics. Got it. So paint us a picture.
Yeah.
What was the energy scene like in Seychelles back then?
Well, according to this study, back in 2019, Seychelles was almost entirely dependent on oil imports. And we're talking about pretty much all of their energy needs, especially for transportation and electricity generation. So, think about it. Almost every car, truck, plane, and power plant was running on fuel that had to be shipped in from somewhere else.
Wow. So it wasn't just a little bit of reliance. It was like almost everything, huh?
Almost everything. In fact, this study points out that the transport sector alone was responsible for more than half of all their oil imports. It just shows how absolutely crucial fossil fuels were to their everyday lives and the economy back then.
Yeah, it makes you realize just how much we take these things for granted sometimes. So all that imported oil,
Mhm.
that must have been a massive expense, right?
Yeah.
Shipping all that fuel to an island nation, it can't be cheap.
You're absolutely right. The logistics of importing that much fuel definitely added a hefty price tag to their energy system. And on top of that, this study highlights another concerning factor. Seychelles had pretty high per capita CO2 emissions. We're talking higher than the average for many developed OECD countries at the time.
So not only expensive, but also, not great for the environment. It sounds like they really needed to make a change and fast.
Oh, absolutely. And to their credit, they have been taking steps towards a more sustainable future. They set some pretty ambitious renewable energy targets. Their initial goal was to reach 15% renewable energy in their power sector by 2030.
Okay, so that's a pretty good start. But you mentioned earlier that they also had a more ambitious long-term vision, right?
Right.
Where do they ultimately want to end up?
Their ultimate goal, 100% renewable energy across the board.
Wow, that's a bold target. So it's not just about cleaning up their power grid. They're aiming for complete energy independence, powered entirely by renewables.
Exactly. And while transitioning the power grid is a huge piece of the puzzle, this study really emphasizes that decarbonizing the transport sector is just as important, if not more so, especially considering how much energy it consumes.
Right, because as we talked about, transportation was gobbling up over half their imported oil. So what's the plan for cleaning up that sector? What kind of solutions are they looking at?
Well, one of the key things they're exploring is the use of sustainable alternatives like e-fuels, which are basically synthetic fuels produced using renewable energy. And that's particularly important for things like ships and airplanes, where electrifying directly might not be feasible with current technology.
Okay, so it's a complex challenge, right?
Yeah.
Trying to balance these really ambitious environmental goals with the practical realities of living on an island nation. And that's where this study with its, let's just call it the wave power study for short, really comes in. It introduces this new tool to help them navigate those complexities.
Right. Future role of wave power in Seychelles.
Yeah, we can call it the wave power study. So tell us more about this EP-ALISON-LUT tool that they use in the study. What's so special about it?
Well, think of it as like a specialized add-on specifically designed to work with this existing software called Energy Plan. And what's really cool is that it allows for super quick and precise techno-economic optimization of renewable energy technologies and energy storage solutions.
Hold on. Techno-economics. So it's not just about the technology itself, it's also factoring in the economics of it all.
Exactly. It considers both how feasible something is from an engineering standpoint and how it actually pencils out financially. Can you actually build it and afford to run it?
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty comprehensive tool then. What kind of things can they actually model with it?
They can model a huge number of potential energy system configurations and future scenarios, and I mean, a lot, like different mixes of renewable energy sources, different types of energy storage. They can even look at different ways to get those e-fuels we talked about, like importing them versus producing them domestically.
Wow, so they can really run the numbers and see what different combinations would look like in the real world. And this study mentions that it's especially good for what they call structured sensitivity analyses. What exactly does that mean?
Imagine you're asking a bunch of what-if questions, but in a very systematic way. Like, what if we increase the amount of solar power? What if we add more wind turbines? What if we change the way we store energy? This tool lets them test out all those different scenarios and see how the entire energy system responds.
So it's not just about finding the most likely outcome. It's about understanding all the different possibilities and potential risks and opportunities.
Okay, that makes sense.
So armed with this fancy new tool, the researchers set out to explore all these different potential futures for Seychelles. What were some of the main scenarios they focused on in this study?
Well, they primarily focused on two main pathways for how Seychelles could meet its future fuel needs, especially for that tricky transport sector. So pathway number one is what they call the EFI scenario. In this one, Seychelles basically imports all those synthetic e-fuels from somewhere else.
Okay, so they're outsourcing the e-fuel production, basically. What's the other pathway they looked at?
The second one is called the EFDP scenario. This one's a bit more ambitious because in this one, Seychelles actually produces those e-fuels domestically, and they do that using this technology called power to liquid, or PTO for short.
Gotcha. So those are the two main ways they envisioned dealing with transportation's hunger for fuel in a more sustainable way. And then within those pathways, how do they go about investigating the role of wave power?
So here's where it gets interesting. They did what's called a sensitivity analysis, where they basically gradually increased the amount of wave power capacity in their model. For the scenarios looking at 2030, they went from 0 wave power all the way up to 500 megawatts.
Wow, that's quite a range.
Yeah, and for the 2050 projections, they went even further, considering up to 1,000 megawatts of wave power. This way, they could really see how much of a difference adding wave power could make under different conditions.
It's like dialing up the wave power and seeing what happens. And on top of that, they also looked at different speeds for how quickly the power and heat sectors could transition to renewable energy by 2030, right?
You got it. They modeled 4 different speeds for that transition: slow, medium, fast, and then a full-on 100% renewable energy transition.
So slow and steady versus going all in on renewables.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so they've got all these different scenarios, all these different factors.
Yeah.
What did they actually find out about the potential of wave power, specifically looking at 2030?
Well, one of the most interesting findings is that in most of the 2030 scenarios where they were trying to optimize for cost, wave power didn't actually make the cut. It wasn't automatically selected as part of the most cost-effective energy system.
So in the short term, it sounds like wave power might face some stiff competition from other renewable sources. Which ones were coming out on top in terms of cost?
This study is pointing to floating solar PV and onshore wind power as the more cost-competitive options in the near term. In fact, they found that when they forced wave power into the system, it often ended up displacing those other two technologies.
So the tool is basically saying, hey, if you're looking for the cheapest way to go green in 2030, solar and wind are probably your best bet.
Exactly, at least based on the assumptions and data that they were using in this study.
So it's not necessarily that wave power is a bad idea. It's just that in the short term, it might not be the most economical choice.
Okay, so what about the impact of wave power on the electricity grid itself? What did they find out about that?
They found that even with a relatively modest amount of wave power, like 50 megawatts in a slow transition scenario, you could end up with a lot of excess electricity being generated.
Oh, really? Why is that? Well, remember those existing diesel-powered generators we talked about. They would still be running in 2030, at least in these scenarios, providing a stable base load of power. But wave power, by its nature, is variable. So you have these periods where the waves are really cranking and producing a lot of electricity on top of what the diesel generators are already putting out.
Ah, I see. So you have this potential for an energy glut, so to speak. Too much electricity being generated at certain times.
Exactly. And that can be a problem because you need to have somewhere to put all that excess energy. That brings us to the next big topic they looked at, which is energy storage. How do you manage all that variable, renewable energy and make sure you have enough power when you need it?
Right, because if the sun isn't shining or the waves aren't crashing, you still need to keep the lights on. So what did they find out about energy storage in these scenarios that included wave power?
Well, they found that hydrogen storage is going to be a key player. It's particularly important for producing those e-fuels and for balancing the grid. But here's where it gets a little bit counterintuitive. In some of the scenarios where they were importing e-fuels, the amount of hydrogen storage actually decreased as they added more wave power.
Oh, that's interesting. So more wave power, less need for storage. How does that work?
It seems like the way wave power interacts with the other energy sources in the system can actually reduce the overall need for hydrogen storage in certain cases. But it's not a simple relationship. It really depends on a lot of different factors.
Okay, so it's not just a simple equation of more renewables equals less storage. It's more nuanced than that. What about batteries? What role do they play in all of this?
Batteries are definitely still in the picture, especially those big stationary batteries for grid-scale storage. And they found a similar trend there. In some cases, as they added more wave power, the need for stationary batteries also decreased.
Interesting. It sounds like wave power might complement other renewable sources in a way that smooths out some of the bumps in the energy supply.
Yeah, that's one possible explanation, but it's something that would need to be studied further to really understand the dynamics at play.
All right, so we've talked about the technology, the different scenarios, the impact on the grid and storage. What about the bottom line? What did they find out about the cost of including wave power in Seychelles' energy mix by 2030?
Well, the overall finding was that increasing wave power capacity in 2030 generally led to a higher total cost for the energy system. So it reinforces that earlier point we discussed that in the near term, wave power might not be the most cost-effective option compared to solar and wind.
Okay, so it comes with a bit of a price premium, but was there anything that could change that equation?
They did find one interesting exception. They found that a full transition to 100% renewable energy for both power and heat by 2030 actually had a positive impact on the levelized cost of final energy, regardless of whether they included wave power or not.
So going all in on renewables could actually make it more affordable in the long run, even if it includes wave power.
That seems to be the case, at least based on their analysis.
Okay, so that's something to consider. It's not just about the upfront cost. It's about the long-term economic benefits of a fully renewable energy system. Okay, so that's 2030. What about looking further ahead to 2050? What does this study say about wave power's potential in the more distant future?
Well, the picture for 2050 looks a bit brighter for wave power, especially in the scenarios where Seychelles is importing those e-fuels. They found that up to 500 megawatts of wave power could actually become a viable option by then.
Also, more wave power potential in the long term. What might be driving that shift?
It's probably a combination of things. It could be that wave power technology itself becomes cheaper and more efficient by 2050. Or it could be that the overall energy system has evolved in a way that makes wave power more attractive.
So it might be a matter of both technology and timing. What about solar PV? Does it still dominate in those 2050 scenarios?
Even in 2050, floating solar PV is still projected to be the main source of electricity, at least in those cost-optimized scenarios. It seems like it's going to remain a key player in Seychelles' energy strategy for the foreseeable future.
All right, so solar's got a pretty firm hold on things. What about energy storage? How does that picture change in those 2050 scenarios?
Well, in the scenarios where Seychelles is producing e-fuels domestically, the need for hydrogen storage actually increases as they add more wave power. But there's another interesting twist. Vehicle-to-grid, or V2G, batteries become more important in 2050, especially as wave power penetration increases.
V2G, so we're talking about using electric car batteries to help stabilize the grid.
Exactly. It's like turning your electric car into a mobile power station. And it seems like that kind of flexibility could become really valuable as more and more variable renewable energy sources like wave power and solar come online.
Okay, so it's not just about building bigger batteries. It's about finding creative ways to integrate all these different pieces of the puzzle. And what about the economics of it all? What's the overall financial outlook for 2050?
Based on this study's analysis, it looks like importing e-fuels might actually be the more economically attractive option for Seychelles in 2050. It suggests that those global markets for sustainable fuels are going to be a big factor in shaping their energy strategy moving forward.
So even though wave power looks more promising in 2050, importing e-fuels might still be the cheaper route. But there's more to consider than just the cost, right? This study also talks about the importance of diversification and energy security. Why are those things so crucial for an island nation like Seychelles?
You're absolutely right. Relying too heavily on any single energy source, even if it's renewable, can be risky. It's like putting all your eggs in one basket. What happens if that one source fails or if something disrupts the supply chain?
Yeah, like a natural disaster or some kind of global crisis. That could be a major problem.
Exactly. So having a more diverse mix of energy sources, including wave power, could make their energy system more resilient and less vulnerable to those kinds of shocks.
It's about spreading the risk, basically. And this study actually makes the case that even if a more diverse system costs a bit more, it might be worth it for the added security and peace of mind.
Exactly. They actually say that a cost-neutral energy system with more diversity might be preferable to a slightly cheaper system that relies heavily on just one technology. It's a matter of balancing cost with long-term stability and resilience.
Okay, so diversification is key. Now, before we wrap up, I'm curious, how do the findings of this study compare to what other researchers have found, both for Seychelles and for other island nations facing similar challenges?
Well, this study points out that their findings about the importance of solar PV are actually in line with a lot of other research that's been done on sunny tropical islands. So it's not just Seychelles, it's a trend they're seeing in other places as well.
Okay, so solar seems to be a pretty safe bet in those environments. What about wind power?
They found that the amount of wind power they identified as optimal in their scenarios actually matches up pretty well with independent estimates of Seychelles' available wind resources. So their model seems to be reflecting reality in that regard.
Okay, so wind's looking good too. What about other renewable options like biofuels? Do they have anything to say about those?
They did look at biofuels, but based on their cost analysis, it seems like they're not quite as competitive compared to other options like solar, wind, and even wave power.
Interesting. So maybe not the best fit for Seychelles, at least economically speaking. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but every study has its limitations. What were some of the key limitations that they acknowledged in this study?
Well, one thing they point out is that their tool, the EP-ALISON-LUT, is really good at analyzing those overnight transitions, like we talked about. But it's not as good at modeling how the system would evolve step by step over many years.
So it's like looking at snapshots instead of a continuous video of the energy transition process.
Exactly. And they also mention that the tool has some limitations when it comes to modeling conventional power plants. It tends to assume they operate in a more consistent baseload mode, which might not always be the case in the real world.
So, bit of a simplification there. Anything else?
Yeah, another thing is that the tool currently only models the reconversion of stored energy back into electricity using hydrogen. So it doesn't really consider other possibilities, like using stored energy directly for heat or other applications.
Okay, so there's room for improvement there. And lastly, they mentioned that the tool itself requires using MATLAB software, which might not be accessible to everyone.
Right, it could be a barrier for some researchers or policymakers who don't have access to that specific software.
All right, so it's a powerful tool, but it's not perfect. And it's important to keep those limitations in mind when interpreting the findings. So to wrap up our deep dive into this study on wave power in Seychelles, what would you say are the key takeaways?
Well, the main takeaway for me is that wave power might not be the cheapest option for Seychelles in the short term, but it definitely has potential in the long run. Especially by 2050, it could become a real contender, particularly if they choose to import those e-fuels.
And it sounds like the idea of diversification, having that mix of different energy sources, is really important too. It's not just about finding the cheapest solution, it's about building a more resilient and secure energy system.
Absolutely, and I think the study really highlights that trade-off. It shows that a more diverse system, even if it costs a bit more, might actually be the smarter choice in the long run, especially for an island nation facing the challenges of climate change and energy independence.
Right. It's about thinking beyond just the immediate costs and considering those long-term benefits. And it's also a reminder that tools like the one they used in this study can be incredibly valuable for policymakers and researchers who are trying to navigate those complex decisions.
Yeah, it's all about having the best possible information to make informed choices about the future.
Absolutely. So as we conclude our deep dive into this wave power study, here's a final thought for you, the listener, to ponder. How much should a nation like Seychelles, or any nation for that matter, be willing to invest to ensure they have a truly sustainable and resilient energy future? It's a question that goes beyond just dollars and cents. It's about values, priorities, and the kind of world we want to live in. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.